When I was 14, my parents decided to move out of state. My 12-year-old brother, Trevor, and I didn't want to move, but we didn't really have any sane family members we could stay with, so unfortunately we had to move with them. We really didn't like the house at first, mostly because it was different from what we've lived with. Readjusting to a new life was probably one of the worst experiences we've ever had. Looking back, I understand that my parents did what had to be done, seeing as how my father's place of employment was shutting down, and the only way to maintain his income was to transfer to an active branch. They gave him a raise for the troubles, so we actually ended up benefiting financially in the long run, and for that reason we quickly got used to the new place. Dad let us do whatever we wanted to our rooms, so there was a bit of comfort we obtained from making it look like our old rooms. We were still lonely though, since all of our closest friends were now a 17-hour drive away from us, but they got to visit once we moved in for about a week before school started. We kept to ourselves mostly. I think deep down we were both afraid of getting attached to new people and then being ripped away from them again. All we had was each other. We knew Tina and Scott would find new best friends and forget all about my brother and me. It wasn't too difficult to keep our distance from people, though. Starting out fresh made it easy to not be bothered by other kids in our class. They didn't know us, and while they were nice, they never went out of their way to befriend us. I liked it that way. Maybe they could tell we didn't feel like socializing. Our neighbors were even easier to stay away from. We moved into a house on a somewhat sizable cul-de-sac. The neighbor across from us was a strange old woman. She never came out to talk to us, but she seemed to be one of those cranky old farts who hate children and eat smelly food. There was a circular median in the center of the cul-de-sac that we played on, and we could always catch a glimpse of the old woman watching us through her blinds. There'd be a spot where we could see she was holding one blind down with her finger, but if we looked in her direction, she'd retreat as if she was afraid of us. Mrs. Abernathy, we learned was her name from looking at her mailbox. Later, we'd learned that she became a hostile shut-in after her husband passed away 3 years before we moved in. She never talked to anyone, but I heard the barking of a small dog coming from her house several times, so I understood that she didn't really want to be alone. I realized I felt the same way, and that's why I sometimes would make small talk with her when we were both outside in hopes that she'd crack a smile or say hello, but she never did. Oh well, I tried. The neighbor to the left of us was a little more social, but I still got the feeling that he didn't want us there. Trevor got the same feeling too. He was a middle-aged man with unkempt, graying hair and a weird smell. It wasn't something I could identify, though. It wasn't body odor, tobacco, booze, grease, or cologne. Trevor could never figure out what the smell was either. This guy's name was Tim, or at least that's what we called him. He introduced himself as Tim, but we both knew that wasn't his name, as his mailbox read L.R. Pinkerton. I don't know why anyone would feel the need to lie to a couple of young teenagers about their name, but we left it alone. The neighbor between Mrs. Abernathy and Mr. Pinkerton was surprisingly nice, but a little too nice. Her name was Heather, and she was maybe in her late 30s or early 40s with an outdated, large brunette hairstyle. It was frizzy and fragile looking, and she kind of looked like an antique, raggedy old doll that was poorly put together. Despite this, she was extremely nice. She introduced herself the day we moved in, and brought over a gift basket with cupcakes and other pastries. My parents got rid of it, since my mom has celiac disease and can't eat gluten, but part of me wonders if they just didn't trust that she didn't poison it. After all, she was a stranger, and although Mom couldn't eat it and Dad doesn't like sweets, Trevor or I could have.
I really think they didn't trust her. Heather was, after all, a little too friendly and would ask weird and even inappropriate questions, like what age we were when we lost our virginity. I was only 14. I was a virgin and assumed Trevor was too. She asked us our blood type, which was pretty weird too. I told myself there was probably a reason she asked, like maybe someone in her family needed an organ transplant, and she needed to know if it's possible we had any diseases. I'm sure that's why she asked. She just went about it rather strangely.
Heather told us things about the other neighbors. Apparently, they were once very close. Maybe they still were, but I had never seen any of them interact with each other. She told me that the houses on the cul-de-sac used to be connected, until the couple that owned the large house retired and eventually passed away, leaving the property to their children, who separated it into multiple homes and rented them out. Later on, they would all be sold. It's hard to imagine how they would have been connected. They must have torn down a lot of the property. One night, a few weeks after moving in, I woke up in the middle of the night to screaming coming from outside the house. It sounded like Trevor. As I practically jumped out of bed and head toward the sound of his voice, I passed his bedroom and noticed he was not in his bed. With one eye still refusing to open entirely, I grabbed his robe without thinking about it, slipped into my boots, and ran out the door where I saw the source of his screaming. "Where is the stairwell?" he kept saying, too many times to count. I kept calling out to him, but he didn't seem to hear me. He was crying horrifically and slowly pacing around the median where we would play. I realized he was sleepwalking, which he had never done before. I've heard stress can do that to a person, but it was still quite unsettling to witness. Against everything I had been advised, I tried to wake him up. I tried shaking him, slapping him, and pushing him toward our house, but he spun around and shoved me down to the ground full force. It hurt, and I was terrified. I didn't know what was going on. I left him alone out of fear, but I also watched him the entire time to make sure he wouldn't do something incredibly dangerous, like walking onto oncoming traffic. The whole time, he was confined to the median and just kept screaming about a stairwell. This was weird because we've never lived in a house with stairs, nor did our grandparents or any relative we would frequently visit. Trevor didn't remember anything the next day. I decided it was best not to tell him. He was clearly stressed out enough as it was. I certainly didn't want to worry him even more. I forced myself to stay awake until he fell asleep. Then I made my rounds around the house and tried to sleepwalk-proof everything. I did this for months. It never happened again, so eventually I became a little less concerned over time. I started to wonder if it was all in my head. Maybe the whole thing was just a dream. Nobody else seemed to have heard it. And Trevor was loud. Our parents never woke up. None of the lights from any of our neighbors' homes came on. Nobody rushed out to yell at him to be quiet since it was in the middle of the night, and I'm sure people were trying to sleep. I know I was. A few days later, I was up late playing some childish game on my computer, and the faint sound of a door shutting caught my attention. It was 2 o'clock in the morning almost. Slightly paranoid, I shut my laptop and looked out my bedroom window. I saw a black figure standing perfectly still. At least that's what it seemed like from so far away. The figure was standing outside Mrs. Abernathy's front door. From a distance, it was hard to make anything out, like whether it was a male or female, what they were wearing, which direction they were facing, that sort of thing. The figure didn't appear to be doing anything in particular, just standing there. I was worried for a moment, but considering
I had just heard the sound of a door closing. I figured it must have been Mrs. Abernathy herself, but I still wasn't certain. Maybe she was just enjoying being outside alone when nobody else was outside to bother her. Whatever the case, I let it go. Things got weirder later on. Mrs. Abernathy continued her usual watching us play on the median. And by play, I now mean just sitting there and talking, really. We were getting too old to play with toys. Honestly, we felt like we were too old to play when we moved in, but we just wanted an excuse to go outside. But she had stopped retreating when we would catch her watching us. It was very unnerving. Mr. Pinkerton would sit with us sometimes, not really welcome, and he would talk to us more and more. Heather was becoming increasingly quiet and keeping to herself more. She was beginning to look seriously ill, like she was dying. Her skin tone was almost completely white. Her fragile hair was breaking off and thinning. She had dark bags under her eyes, and the edges of her lips seemed to recede further toward her ears whenever she would smile. Again, I heard a door faintly shut one night later that week. I was naturally as curious about Mrs. Abernathy's behavior as she was about mine. So once again, I closed my laptop and looked out the window, wondering if I'd see anything interesting this time around. I saw a dark figure again, nothing unusual. Probably just Mrs. Abernathy herself. But this time, the figure wasn't standing as close to her front door. It was toward the end of her yard. It still wasn't anything that interesting. The figure was just standing there, and as creepy as a black figure just standing there in the middle of the night would be, it didn't seem to pose any threat. It still gave me chills. This was starting to bother me, so not knowing where else to turn, I went to visit Heather one day for advice. She invited me in and poured me a cup of tea and offered me some cookies. I accepted, not having any sweets since I had lived here due to Mom's gluten allergy. She still looked sick, but maybe this was normal for her. I really didn't know. After about 10 minutes in her home, I gathered the courage to bring up what had been happening outside Mrs. Abernathy's house. When asked what I was referring to, I started out with the fact that she always seemed to peek through her blinds to watch me and my brother outside. She used to retreat when we caught her, but she stopped doing that. And that lately, I had been seeing black figures outside her home late at night. I watched Heather's expression turn dark. She seemed afraid of something, but all she said was, "You shouldn't be here." I was confused and asked her why she was saying this all of a sudden. Her tone raised and she told me, "You need to leave now." I left Heather's house and decided to burden my little brother with this weird activity. There wasn't much to go off of, so he probably either thought I was crazy and hallucinating, or thought that I had become even nosier than Mrs. Abernathy was. He offered to stake out in my room with me to see what was happening. I wasn't counting on him having binoculars, but it made it a little more interesting and less worrisome. We even walked up to the nearest gas station to buy donuts and coffee to make it feel like a real stakeout. We got a box big enough for 6 donuts. I found some frosted ones with sprinkles. Trevor put in a couple glazed ones and a cinnamon roll. We paid and left, and by the time we came home, it was already after 1 o'clock in the morning. Our parents didn't even know we were gone, and wouldn't have allowed it regardless since we were minors, so we snuck in through the garage door. We got situated in my bedroom, and as 2 o'clock was rapidly approaching, we already had all lights off, and my laptop put away on my desk. We took turns with the binoculars, careful to not get too much donut frosting on them. We once again saw the black figure exit her home. Certainly it must have been Mrs. Abernathy. The door was left wide open, illuminating the room behind her, so we could only see a silhouette. Taking very slow, exaggerated steps, as if it was part of some physical therapy for her, she slowly made it out to the street between her yard and the median. "She keeps venturing further from her yard," I whispered.
"What do you mean?"
Trevor asked with a mouthful of donut. I explained to him, once she stepped out in the middle of the street, that on the first night I watched her do this, she was still standing on her porch and didn't move. And the next time, she had made it to the end of her yard. He suggested that she was probably one of those weird people who were afraid to leave their homes, and that she was trying to conquer that fear. And she probably chose to do it late at night since nobody else was out, so there would be no distractions or performance anxiety. It made sense, but still, there was something about the way she walked, and for how long, and when she would stop and just stand there, that made it really unnerving. All of this weird activity was causing us to be really tired throughout the day, so we decided it was best to stop spying on Mrs. Abernathy, as much as we figured she'd welcome it, since she was always spying on us. But we still had classes, and we needed to be awake at 6 a.m., and 4 hours of sleep a night simply wasn't going to cut it. So instead, we set up some security cameras. Yes, I know what you're probably thinking. Security cameras for something non-threatening in a peaceful neighborhood? I admit, I was kind of obsessed with this. After about a week, we reviewed the footage and didn't find anything unusual, for the most part. Mrs. Abernathy was continuing her journey toward exploring the world outdoors. Secretly, I was proud of her, and was silently rooting for her to face her fears and become a stronger person. I thought it was really inspiring. But at the same time, I didn't really like how far out she was venturing. The footage on her camera was still a bit grainy and hard to see sometimes, but she had made it all the way to the edge of our yard. That was fine, but there was something odd that we never saw until this camera caught it when she was closer to our house. Mrs. Abernathy was not wearing anything. Now, for an elderly lady to roam around outside with no clothes on is one thing if she's senile and doesn't know what she's doing. But these were 35-degree nights, just barely not freezing. I certainly wasn't going to confront her about it. I figured she too, just like my brother, may have been sleepwalking. It's strange though, it only happened to Trevor once. With Mrs. Abernathy, it was a recent and reoccurring event. I honestly didn't think sleepwalking was as common as it was, but I was proven wrong. My suspicion was verified as I continued to watch the video and discovered that Mrs. Abernathy was unwilling to move, even when a car was using our cul-de-sac to turn around. She had no sense of fear, consequences, humiliation, or decency. My heart sank when I realized she wasn't trying to conquer some fear. But I quickly went back to minding my own business and not worrying about some old lady across the street. Right around Thanksgiving break from classes, things got even weirder. First, my camera was nowhere to be found. Trevor, Mom, and Dad all denied taking it. I swore up and down that we had been robbed, but it was the only thing missing. So I really have no choice but to accept the fact that I put it somewhere it doesn't belong, that I would never find. So I really gave up on figuring out what was going on with Mrs. Abernathy. That same night, I woke up to sounds just outside my window. It sounded like someone stepping on the tree twigs in our yard.
and approaching to the bed of rocks underneath my windowsill. In my groggy state, I looked up at my clock, and it was 2:09 in the morning. I had never been so terrified in my life. I practically jolted awake, and I didn't fall back asleep once that night. I should have called the police. I don't know why I didn't. I had never been so creeped out in my life. No, I don't know for sure, but given the circumstances, I knew she was right outside my window. I talked to Trevor later that day when both our parents were at work. This incident took place exactly 1 year after I found him sleepwalking. I never did tell him about it. I took him into my room and showed him something on my window that confirmed my suspicion. There was a smudge on the outside of the window, in just the right spot for a human to have left secretions from their forehead if they were to lean against it. This had to stop. It was getting out of hand. Trevor volunteered to go over to her house and talk to her, but I told him no. Still, being the defiant little brother that he wasn't going to just sit there and take it like I apparently was. I couldn't stop him. He may have been younger than me, but I couldn't physically overpower him. I was alone in the house and decided to relax in my room. I decided to take my mind off of everything. I made a nice hot cup of tea and took it to bed with me, where I pulled out my laptop and began educating myself on astronomy, for no other reason than it was fascinating and gave me something to occupy my obsessed mind. There I sat, quietly reading large amounts of text about black holes when I heard a very faint giggle. I held my breath and looked out my window. I saw nothing out of the ordinary and checked the volume on my laptop. It was muted. I thought it might have been just in my imagination, but I heard whispering later. I didn't have any useful weapons to protect myself with, but Trevor's binoculars were still sitting on my desk, so I grabbed the strap, prepared to swing it at whatever intruder was in my home. I followed the voices slowly, carefully. When I entered the living room, I stepped on a squeaky floorboard. I knew it was squeaky, but in my focused state of mind, I hadn't considered it. And at the same time, I didn't think anything out of the ordinary when I stepped on it. Until I noticed how, immediately afterward, the voices stopped. Maybe I was just dreaming the entire time. Maybe the sound of me stepping on the squeaky floorboard was enough to fully wake me up. And that's why I stopped hearing the voices. There's no basement in this house, and since I was hearing voices directly below me, I knew I was hearing things. It simply wasn't possible. I never told anyone about that night, but it kept haunting me ever since. Something just didn't sit right with me. Never in my life had I experienced any sleeping problems. I never had any problems falling asleep, staying asleep, or staying in bed while I'm asleep. I've never had any night terrors or sleep-talking episodes. I had never needed to question if I was awake or asleep, and neither had Trevor prior to moving here. I tried telling my parents how desperately I wanted to move back home, but they insisted it simply wasn't an option, unless, of course, I were to drop out of school and get a full-time job and support myself. If Trevor wanted to move, I would have had to support us both. It was clear to me they had no intentions of ever leaving, and they had the audacity to shame me for the way that I felt. They never looked at me the same again. If I would have known that letting my feelings be known to them would make them act so negatively toward me, I would have run away before the move ever happened. But it's too late for that, so running away now would have to do. I didn't want to tell anyone what I was about to do. I had no plan, but I needed to at least feel Trevor out for coming with me. I lightly tapped on his bedroom door late at night to see if he was awake. He didn't answer, but I carefully entered anyway. It seemed like he was in a trance. There he was, staring out the window, completely spaced out. He was standing straight up and perfectly still, almost like a statue. I can't remember exactly what I said to him, but I know I was trying to figure out if he was willing to leave with me right then and there. He was unresponsive. I called out to him several times before touching him lightly on the arm. He was ice cold. I realized he wasn't awake, and that terrified me. I suddenly felt very tired myself, even though I had plenty of sleep the night before and hadn't been awake long enough to be this tired. The next thing I knew, I woke up in a pitch-black room. I couldn't see anything. I wondered if I had suddenly fallen asleep in Trevor's room and he turned the lights off. But I was cold and didn't have any covers and woke up on a hard concrete floor. It was a little wet and stinky, but I had no other clues to figure out what was going on. It felt like it was about 40 degrees, but the moisture felt like ice on my skin. I tried to stand up, and I got dizzy. I think the darkness made it hard to tell if I was upright. I, of course, was panicking at this point because I didn't know where I was or how I had gotten there. Then I heard my brother's voice yelling something that chilled me to the bone. "Where is the stairwell?" Again. Only this time it deeply disturbed me because his voice was coming from directly above me. I froze in terror and listened to him scream several more times before trying to call out to him. I called out to him repeatedly, but he never acknowledged my cries. I heard him stomp around above me, and then he stepped on that same squeaky floorboard I had stepped on earlier, just moments before the front door opened. I felt something on my lips, and I don't know what it was or why it was touching me, but I was petrified with fear. I managed to back up about a foot so that whatever it was no longer touching me. Trevor was no longer directly above me, but the screaming continued. I wanted to call out to him, but I was afraid something might happen to me. I'm still here. I'm alone. I can't find my way out. Trevor is screaming again. Nobody has come looking for me. My eyes still haven't adjusted to the dark. I fear I'll never get out. I have no idea how long I've been down here, but I'm hungry, and I'm tired, and I'm cold, and I can't find my way out. Please help me.